To continue with section 4, this absolutely brilliant and essential part of Landsberg's essay, clearly death is traumatic. Death is a cataclysm. Death is a catastrophe. Why? This is Landsberg's best bet of whatever our actual experience of death is. The experience we have of being with a dying person. And what makes it such a catastrophic and traumatic experience is the shattering of community. As he says on the top of page 201, the awareness of the necessity of death is only provoked by participation, by the personal love in which the whole experience is bathed. We constituted a we with a dying man, and it is through this we, through the very strength of this community, which constitutes, as it were, a new order of persons, that we are led into an experiential knowledge of our own mortality. For a moment, we have our feet in the land of the dead. A moment later, we are once more outside the kingdom of shadows. But during that moment, we experience its bitter cold, and no one is ever quite the same after he has felt it. It is perhaps metaphoric. I don't know how literal we can put it, but the experience of the death of the other is, to a certain experience, an experience of my own death, and that's, again, because of the presence of love. As he put it, as he says on the top of page 202, my community with this person seems shattered, but the community was to some degree myself. And to this degree, I experience death in the very core of my own existence. It is the experience of death and the solitude that follows loss. So one can see again how very Christian this is. If we take the essence, I guess there's plenty of essences of Christianity, but what would Christianity be without love? That is Christianity, isn't it? The experience of the death of the loved one is the closest we come to the experience of our own death. Again, these things have to be taken for what they are and thought about and criticized. And perhaps we disagree with it. That seems to be what he's saying here. And it is extremely interesting. That is, we think about what he's saying about death and the menace of death, the threat of death, which was our newfound clarity in seeing what death really is, which we only gain when we become true individuals, persons or selves, is also an experience that's made possible when we are in a relationship with another person or self, a community. That is, let's see. And this is where he believes we can find the necessity of death. I'm not sure I quite understand what he says about necessity here, but it's still an incredibly important part of his thought. This is on page 201. He says, the sense of the necessity of death, which is in cause here, is not identical with the sense of a general statement of necessity, which allots any one form of death to any one of our species. The necessity is chiefly related to those whom we love and to ourselves. This sphere, within which we are really aware of the threat of death, is surrounded by a vague, obscure horizon filled with other human figures, real and possible, past and future. I don't know if you've ever talked with a child about death. At a certain point, children become aware of death and they want to talk about it. My own child, I had that experience, And to me, it does bear out a lot of what Landsberg says. A child's realization of her mortality is the realization of the necessity of death to a certain extent. I remember my daughter, when she began to talk about it in the dark, as I was reading to her, talking to her, she was putting her down to bed. I always remember that when she began to talk about death, one of the first things she said is, "What are we going to do about it? What are we going to do about it?" Which, of course, is a very difficult question as a parent because there's no answer. That is, there's no solution to the problem of death in any obvious sense. But it was that we. What are we going to do about it? I think that is typical of children when they become aware of death. It is not solely in relation to themselves. That it's not just that they realize that they're going to die, which of course they do, but they think of it in concert with the deaths of the people that they love, their parents, the people, other people in their lives. When they realize not only that they're going to die and that is their future, but that their loved ones, the people they love, are going to die. And I think that really, to me, just personally, really bears out what Landsberg says here is that the fear of death is rarely a selfish thing. I mean, it can be, I'm sure, but my own speculation is that Landsberg is right, and what we are really afraid of is isolation and the shattering of the community of love. So that if indeed Landsberg is correct and the real nature of death is threat, menace, danger, enemy, it's because it's a threat and a menace to community. It seeks us to, the real danger of death is that it threatens to isolate us from the ones that we love, to shatter the community. I'll just leave you with one thing. One of my favorite guilty pleasure movies is the version of Frankenstein that was done in the 90s, where Robert De Niro plays the monster and Kenneth Branagh plays Dr. Frankenstein. And there's a great line when the young Frankenstein is a medical student and he's doing his experiments where he tries to bring dead bodies back to life. And a friend of his says, "Victor, this is crazy, man. Like, what are you doing here? Why are you doing this? Why are you trying to do this?" And Frankenstein, sort of surprised, and just says, "Well, because I think that people who love each other should be together forever." Very Landsbergian thought. And what is otherwise a fairly silly movie, but really a good movie, I think. That notion that really it embodies, I think, a lot of what Landsberg's getting at. Is that what really makes death problematic is that we are persons. And one of the things that makes us special as persons is love, which in its highest form, I would suppose, Landsberg would say is only really possible between persons. I mean, you can love your pet, but it's not the same. Sorry, it's not the same as loving a person. And the recognition of death as a threat and menace and as something to be conquered, which is, of course, the Christian's view of Christ, at least in part, is of the conqueror over, the victor over death. That there's no reason that persons, that we almost demand that persons not be separated by death, that persons must continue. They're not mere organisms. They're not mere members of the species Homo sapiens. They are persons, and that love that they have really demands that choice for an afterlife, for continued existence, or what I'm characterizing as Landsberg's argument for a being beyond death, which would take us to of Landsberg's The Experience of Death, which is what we will begin with next week.